The walls were going up. The harbor was being sealed. The greatest city in the Western Greek world had maybe weeks, possibly days, before it collapsed. The men inside Syracuse knew it. Their grain stores were failing. Their generals were panicking. A faction inside the city was already negotiating surrender terms. Athens had done it. After 2 years of war across 1,000 miles of open sea, the most ambitious military expedition in Greek history was on the verge of total victory. Then one general looked up at a night sky, watched the moon go dark, and decided to wait. 27 days. That is all he needed to wait. 27 days ordered by priests reading shadows on the moon. And in those 27 days, everything reversed. The besiegers became the besieged. The navy was destroyed in the harbor. The army, 40,000 men, the finest force Athens had ever assembled, dissolved into the Sicilian countryside, hunted through river gorges by the people they had come to conquer. 200 warships lost, 40,000 soldiers dead, enslaved or broken in stone quarries under a Sicilian sun. And behind it all, not a Spartan sword, but one man's paralysis. One general who could not leave, commanding a war he had never believed in, making decisions that turned a certain victory into the catastrophe that destroyed Athens forever. This is the story of how the most powerful empire in the ancient world handed its enemies the knife and held still while they used it. This is the story of Nicias, and the war Athens lost to itself. To understand what Athens threw away, you first have to understand what Athens had become. By 415 BC, Athens was not just a city, it was the center of gravity of the entire Greek world, a radical democracy, where every male citizen voted, where generals were elected and removed, where foreign policy was hammered out in open debate before tens of thousands of people on a hill called the Pnyx. But underneath the democracy was something harder, an empire. A naval empire stretched across the Aegean, binding hundreds of island and coastal cities into a tribute system that funneled silver, timber, and soldiers back to Athens. Every year, every city, no exceptions. That empire had been built on the bones of the Persian Wars. When Athens broke the Persian fleet at Salamis in 480 BC, it emerged as the dominant sea power in the Greek world, and it had never let go. What followed was decades of expansion, of tribute extraction, of a city growing wealthier and more confident and more dangerous, circling the one rival it could never fully eliminate. Sparta. Sparta was everything Athens was not. Closed, militarized, built on the absolute subjugation of its enslaved Helot population, who outnumbered their masters 7-1 and required constant, brutal suppression just to keep quiet. Sparta owned the land. Athens owned the sea. And for 40 years, these two incompatible civilizations had circled each other through proxy wars and diplomatic crises, accumulating grievances like debt, until the Peloponnesian War finally began in 431 BC, 16 years of grinding, annual Spartan invasions burning the grain fields of Attica, Athenian naval raids hammering the Peloponnesian coast, a catastrophic plague that killed perhaps a quarter of Athens's population. By 421 BC, both sides had bled each other into a fragile truce, the Peace of Nicias, that satisfied no one and settled nothing. The battles stopped. The ambitions did not. And Athens had begun looking west. Because beyond the Italian peninsula, across a narrow channel, lay Sicily. Enormous, nearly the size of Greece itself. Rich with grain, timber, and merchant wealth. Its largest city, Syracuse, was a Dorian colony, culturally aligned with Sparta, powerful enough to dominate the island on its own terms. If Athens could take Syracuse, it would break the Western Mediterranean open. New tribute, new resources, a stranglehold on grain routes Sparta depended on. Not one empire, two. The East already in hand, the West waiting to be taken. This was not fantasy. It was calculation. And in 415 BC, one man was absolutely certain it could be done. His name was Alcibiades, and everything about the Sicilian Expedition, the ambition, the momentum, the catastrophic miscalculation, ran through him. Alcibiades was the most brilliant political figure in Athens since Pericles. Aristocratic in bearing, democratic in method, charming in a way that made even his enemies listen before they hated him. He had fought well. He had spoken better. He had accumulated allies across every faction in the city. He had also accumulated enemies, men who saw in his ambition something that could not be controlled, and who were waiting for the right moment to destroy him. But in 415 BC, none of that had landed yet. In 415 BC, Alcibiades had a vision. Take Sicily, break Syracuse, extend Athenian dominance into the Western Mediterranean, and return to a triumph that would make him untouchable. He went to the assembly and made his case. The arguments were sound. The rhetoric was extraordinary. The crowd went electric. Standing against him was Nicias. Nicias was the anti-Alcibiades in every sense. Cautious, conservative, deeply, almost compulsively religious. Already in failing health, ancient sources describe a chronic kidney ailment that would worsen with every month he spent in the field. He had negotiated the peace. He believed in the peace. He thought Sicily was an overreach, a gamble too far, a war Athens could not afford to lose. And so he tried something audacious. He would kill the expedition, not by arguing against it. The assembly was already too excited, but by inflating its cost until the scale itself scared them off. He stood before the assembly and said, "If you want to do this, do it right. We need a massive fleet. Far more troops than you planned. More ships, more cavalry, more silver." The assembly listened. The assembly cheered. Then the assembly voted for the larger fleet. It was the most consequential miscalculation in Athenian political history. Nicias had tried to use the democracy's caution against its ambition, and the democracy's ambition simply swallowed the larger number and asked when they were leaving. The expedition was now real, enormous, irreversible. 3 generals assigned to command it: Alcibiades, who designed it; Nicias, who had just accidentally funded it; and Lamachus, an old professional soldier. No political games, no grand ambitions, just a man who had looked at a map of Sicily and said the only logical move was to sail straight to Syracuse and attack before the city had time to prepare. 3 men, 3 incompatible strategies. 1 fleet. In the spring of 415 BC, 134 triremes, 5,100 hoplites, 480 archers, 700 slingers, and thousands of support oarsmen and sailors departed the harbor of Piraeus. Thucydides watched them go. He wrote that the scene was simultaneously magnificent and terrifying. The wealthiest ships decorated like festival vessels, the crews the finest in the city, the harbor packed with people weeping and cheering. And in more than a few faces, if you watched carefully, not joy, a particular kind of dread, the dread of a city that has gone too far and can feel it but cannot stop. The fleet had barely cleared the harbor when the first fracture opened. On the night before departure, someone had moved through the streets of Athens and systematically destroyed the Herms, The carved stone pillars at every crossroads in the city, each bearing the image of the god Hermes, sacred objects, public symbols of divine protection. To deface them was not vandalism. It was sacrilege, a deliberate assault on the gods who protected the city's boundaries. The morning after, Athens woke to hundreds of desecrated stone faces staring from every corner. The political explosion was immediate. Alcibiades' enemies moved. He was accused, without proof, but without need of it, of being behind the sacrilege, of mocking the gods, of running some private oligarchic conspiracy against the state. In Athens, impiety was not a political charge. It was an existential one. It meant the gods had been insulted. It meant the expedition itself was cursed. Alcibiades demanded a trial before the fleet left. His enemies refused. Better, they calculated, to let him sail, and then recall him in the middle of the campaign, when the scandal had festered further and he was too far from home to defend himself. And that is exactly what happened. Weeks after the expedition reached Sicily and begun its initial operations, an Athenian trireme arrived with orders. Alcibiades was recalled. He had to return to face trial. He agreed. He boarded a ship, and then, passing through the Athenian colony of Thurii, he vanished. He was not found. The ship returned empty. Days later, word came from the Peloponnese. Alcibiades had surfaced in Sparta. The architect of the Sicilian Expedition had defected to Athens's greatest enemy, taking with him everything he knew about Athenian strategy, Athenian weaknesses, and Athenian plans. The man with the vision was gone. What remained in Sicily was Nicias, commanding a war he had publicly opposed, running a strategy he had never designed, leading troops who expected boldness and a mission that required exactly that. The expedition had lost its mind. What was left was its body, and no one with the will to drive it. Here is what history buries under the weight of the disaster. Before it went wrong, it nearly went right. Nicias was cautious, but he was not incompetent. With Lamachus still alive and providing the aggressive edge, Athens made a series of brilliant tactical moves that brought Syracuse to the edge of collapse faster than anyone had expected. The first test came in autumn 415 BC. Nicias needed to engage the Syracusan army in a pitched battle, but he needed to do it on ground where Syracuse's cavalry, their single greatest military advantage, could not operate. Syracusan horsemen on open terrain could run down hoplites at will. On narrow ground, between a slope and the sea, they were useless. So Nicias ran a deception. He sent a secret agent into Syracuse carrying a false message. The Athenians had stowed their weapons away from camp. They were unprepared. Come catch them. Syracuse took the bait. Their army marched at dawn toward Catana. By the time they arrived, the Athenian camp was empty. Athens had moved its entire army by sea overnight, landing just outside Syracuse itself on a narrow strip between the coast and the Temple of Zeus, exactly the ground where cavalry could not deploy. The battle the next day was clean. Athens charged first. The Syracusan left flank crumbled under the Argive allies. The Athenian center drove through. Syracuse fled. They lost 260 men. Athens lost 50. The road to the city stood open, and then Nicias retreated to Catana for the winter. This is the first crack. The window after a decisive victory is short. A shattered enemy is not a surrendered one, but a shattered enemy given a winter to rebuild its walls, replace its generals, and restore its morale is a different problem entirely. Nicias's caution gave Syracuse exactly the time it needed. In the spring of 414 BC, Athens returned with a strategy that could have ended the war in weeks: circumvallation. A wall from the heights above the city, across the plateau of Epipolaio, down to the harbor. Complete encirclement. No supplies in, no reinforcements out, no escape, just starvation. The strategy had worked against Potidæa. It would work here. And for a few weeks, an achingly close stretch of weeks, it was working. Athens seized the heights of Epipolae fast. Forts went up. The walls extended north toward the high ground, south toward the great harbor. Every Syracusan sortie to stop the construction was beaten back. Inside the city, the debate had already shifted from whether to resist to whether to surrender. A faction inside Syracuse was actively exploring capitulation terms. The city was days from the end. One more stretch of wall closed. That was all it needed. Then Lamachus died. A minor skirmish. Wrong place, wrong moment. Not a great last stand. Just an old soldier, gone. But the effect on the campaign was not minor. Lamachus was the aggressive force in the Athenian command. He was the one who pushed when Nicias hesitated, who converted caution into momentum, who kept the siege tightening when everything in Nicias wanted to slow down. Without him, the entire strategic character of the army shifted overnight. Nicias was now alone, and Nicias alone left a gap in the northern wall. Why? The sources don't give us certainty. Difficult terrain. A plan to return. The death of his counterpart draining the urgency from the work. What the sources give us is a consequence. A section of wall on the northern heights of Epipolae, left open, unfortified, for weeks that would decide the war. His name was Gylippus, and he was never supposed to matter. He was a Mostax, Spartan by culture but of mixed birth, not a full citizen in Sparta's rigidly hierarchical world. He had been given a small force, barely enough to call a relief column, and sent west with instructions to do what he could for Syracuse. Sparta was not even sure it was worth the effort. The reports coming back suggested Athens was close to winning. That was because Alcibiades had made sure they understood the full picture. He had walked into the Spartan council chambers and laid out everything Athens intended. Sicily was not the end. After Sicily, Carthage. After Carthage, the resources of the Western Mediterranean. Then back east with a force no coalition could resist. He had designed the expedition. He knew exactly where the momentum pointed, and he described it with enough precision to turn Spartan hesitation into action. Gylippus was that action. He landed at Himera on Sicily's northern coast, a tiny force, an unknown name. The locals greeted him anyway, because any alternative to Athenian dominance was welcome. He gathered Sicilian allies as he marched south. He was not yet a formidable army, but he was fast, and he understood one thing clearly. The variable was time. Meanwhile, a single Corinthian vessel slipped through the Athenian naval cordon in darkness and reached Syracuse. Help is coming. Hold on. Nicias's scouts had reported Gylippus's movements. The gap in the northern wall was known. The threat was visible. And Nicias did not close the gap. He did not intercept the march. He did not treat the approaching column as the emergency it was. Gylippus reached the heights. He looked north from the Epipolae plateau and saw the wall and the opening. He marched his force directly through it. He occupied the fort at Labdalum on the northern heights, the single position that, if Athens had held it, would have completed the encirclement and ended the war. The Athenian siege line had been cut in two. What followed was a race of walls. Athens built south toward the harbor. Gylippus and the suddenly inspired Syracusan forces built counterwalls north to south, cutting across the Athenian lines, blocking the encirclement that had been days from completion. Athens attacked twice to stop the construction. They won the first engagement, lost the second, badly. The Athenian right flank was broken by Syracusan cavalry, and in the chaos that followed, Syracuse tore down a large section of Athenian walls that had taken weeks to build. The siege was no longer a siege, it was a stalemate, and in warfare, a stalemate against a defender is never neutral. It always favors the defense. Every week that passed, Syracuse received more supplies, more reinforcements, more morale. Every week that passed drained Athens of silver, of men, of the one thing an expeditionary army could not replace: the belief in its own momentum. Nicias wrote home. His letter, preserved by Thucydides, is one of the most remarkable military documents in the ancient world. Not a commander's report, a confession. A general writing to his government to say, "The situation is beyond my control. Ask for reinforcement, or give me permission to come home." Athens read the letter. Athens sent more men. The democracy could not face the alternative. Demosthenes arrived in the spring of 413 BC. He came like a storm. He was the general Athens needed, the hero of Pylos, the man who had trapped an entire Spartan force on an island and forced the first Spartan mass surrender anyone could remember. His soldiers trusted him. His enemies feared him. And when he sailed his reinforcing fleet into the great harbor and looked at what 2 years of Nicias's command had produced, he understood immediately what Nicias had spent months refusing to see. It was worse than the letters had described. The siege lines were fractured and incomplete. The Athenian camp around the harbor was sick. The marsh air had brought malaria and dysentery through the tents, and men who should have been fighting were barely standing. The morale of soldiers who had been in Sicily for nearly 2 years without decisive victory had curdled past despair into something quieter and more dangerous. And the Syracusan navy, which Athens had once controlled effortlessly, was now actively challenging them in the harbor itself. Gylippus had inspired Syracuse to modify their warships. Shorter, heavier prows built for battering in confined water, rather than the open sea speed that made Athenian triremes lethal. In the tight dimensions of the great harbor, Athenian naval superiority was gone. Demosthenes looked at all of it, measured it, and made the only rational decision available: leave, now. By sea, before the situation deteriorates further. The army is still intact enough to fight through. The navy still outnumbers Syracuse, and Athens with 200 warships and 30,000 soldiers is still a superpower. An Athens that remains here until those assets are spent is finished. He made the argument to Nicias directly, clearly, without softening. Nicias refused. His reasons were complex, and in their way, deeply human. He told Demosthenes he had contacts inside Syracuse, men who wanted to betray the city and were only waiting for the right signal. He told Demosthenes the situation could still be retrieved. And then he said the thing that reveals everything. He feared what the assembly would do to him in Athens more than what Syracuse could do to him in Sicily. Better to die here than to return home and be tried and executed for failing a war he had always said was wrong. This was not cowardice. It was the specific terror of a man trapped between 2 forms of destruction by a democratic system that demanded victory and made retreat politically lethal. Athens had put Nicias in an unwinnable position, and then made withdrawal just as fatal as staying. He was not paralyzed by weakness. He was paralyzed by a system that had removed all safe options. Demosthenes argued. He pushed. He wore Nicias down over days of council debates. Finally, the generals agreed on one more attempt, a massive night assault on the heights of Epipolae. One final gamble. If they could destroy the Syracusan counterwall, restore the encirclement, and bring the siege back to its moment of near victory, they stayed. If it failed, they left immediately. No more delays, no more reasons. Demosthenes planned it with everything he had: silence, speed, surprise. The heights taken before dawn, the counter-wall demolished, Syracuse once again facing the starvation that had nearly broken it months earlier. In the darkness of a Sicilian summer night, it very nearly worked. Demosthenes took his force up the heights in silence. The initial assault was stunning. The Syracusan outposts on Epipolae were taken by surprise. The defenders scattered. The Athenians pushed forward, tearing down sections of the counter-wall, advancing toward positions that, if held by morning, would restore the encirclement and change the war. For one extraordinary moment in the darkness, the balance actually shifted. Athens was winning. Then the moon came up. Night battles are almost never won. The ancient world understood this in its bones, which is why armies almost never attempted them. In darkness, formations dissolve. Commands don't carry 20 feet. Friend and enemy become identical shapes in shadow. The advantage of training evaporates, because training depends on vision, on coordination, on reading the ground in front of you. On the broken terrain of Epipolae, as the moon finally rose and threw long, contradictory shadows across the heights, the Athenian advance collapsed into chaos. Units fighting forward in some places and retreating in others. Men firing into the figures ahead of them without knowing if they were Athenians or Syracusans. No one could find the front. A Boeotian regiment fighting for Syracuse. Professional soldiers from central Greece who had served in more engagements than most Athenian officers had seen, formed up in the moonlight and drove hard into the Athenian left flank. The retreat became a rout. Men fell from the cliffs of Epipolae into the darkness below. When dawn came, the heights were still held by Syracuse. Demosthenes called the generals together. His assessment was short. The night assault had failed. The last option was gone. They had to leave now, before the window closed entirely. Even now, Nicias hesitated. His contacts inside Syracuse, he said. The city would still fall from within. Just a little longer. Demosthenes looked at the army around them, sick, shattered, psychologically broken by the night's disaster, and said what was true. Every day they stayed was a day Syracuse grew stronger and Athens grew weaker. There was no longer any path to victory. There was only the question of how many men survived the exit. After days of argument that should have taken hours, Nicias finally gave in. The retreat was ordered. The ships were prepared. The army would leave. On the night before departure, the moon went dark. Total eclipse. The moon swallowed completely by the shadow of the earth. To modern eyes, a remarkable astronomical event. To an Athenian army already cracked by 2 years of failure, by disease, by the psychological wreckage of Epipolae, it was a divine verdict. The soothsayers came to Nicias. The army must wait 27 days before moving. The gods had spoken. To leave now was impiety. Nicias, ill, exhausted, fighting his own paralysis for months, looking for any authority outside himself that could make the decision he could not make alone, agreed. The army waited, and in those 27 days, the trap closed. Gylippus had been out of Syracuse gathering Sicilian allies when the eclipse happened. He returned to find the Athenian army still in the harbor, motionless, waiting, a 40,000-man force held in place by the shadow of the moon. He understood immediately what had been given to him. He reorganized the Syracusan fleet. He reinforced the harbor chain. He positioned his land forces to seal every overland route south and west. He did not waste a single one of those 27 days. Before Athens could move, Syracuse struck first. The Syracusan army broke through the Athenian wall on the harbor shore. The next day, 76 Syracusan warships sailed out to engage 86 Athenian ships in the confined water of the great harbor. Athens had more ships. It did not matter. There was no room to maneuver, no open water in which Athenian speed and seamanship meant anything. The heavier Syracusan prows did what they were built to do. Athens was driven back. The entrance to the harbor was blocked, a chain of Syracusan vessels sealing the exit from the inside. 40,000 Athenians and allies were now surrounded on a foreign shore. Sea closed, land controlled by the enemy. No allies within reach. The people who had sailed here to conquer Syracuse were now, without a single formal battle lost, completely encircled by it. The greatest expedition in Athenian history had inverted entirely. The besiegers were the besieged. Athens made one final attempt to break out by sea. They loaded every man who could hold an oar onto every ship still floating. Not a military operation, desperation wearing the shape of one. The Syracusan fleet met them inside the harbor. The tight water, the battering prows, the absence of room to accelerate. The Athenian fleet was wrecked. The survivors were driven back to shore and did not try again. The sea was closed. There was only one direction left: overland. Through a countryside crawling with Syracusan cavalry, through mountain passes already guarded, across rivers already held. 40,000 men, sick, starving, stripped of equipment, marching past their own unburied dead, moving into a landscape that had no intention of letting them through. Nicias led the front. Demosthenes commanded the rear. That positioning mattered, because when the column began to fracture, it was Demosthenes who bore the collapse first. They left at dawn, 40,000 men, stretching across miles of Sicilian road, moving southeast toward Camarina, away from the harbor that had consumed everything they had brought. Thucydides writes about this march with the controlled economy of a man who knew that plain words were more devastating than any dramatization. He notes that those who watched the army depart were struck not by the numbers, but by the diminishment. The same men who had arrived 2 years earlier with decorated ships and festival-level confidence, aged in a way that had nothing to do with time. They marched past their own dead, men they could not stop to bury, could not stop for anything. On the first day, they made only a few miles. On the second, the mountain pass to the south was already blocked. Syracusan forces had moved ahead of them in darkness and held the high ground. 2 attempts to break through failed. A third route led them toward the river. By the 5th day, the men were desperate for water. The Syracusan cavalry was not charging, it was tracking, harassing the flanks, exhausting the pace. The strategy of a predator that does not need to commit. It only needs to wait for the prey to stop moving. On the 5th day, the column split. The terrain forced it. Nicias moved ahead with his division. Demosthenes fell behind with his. 40,000 men become 20 and 20, and 20,000 men with no cavalry, no supply line, and no escape route are not a division. They are a target. Demosthenes' rear force was surrounded on a hillside. What followed was not a battle. There was no charge, no clash of spears, no heroic final stand. The Syracusans simply encircled the Athenian force and carpet-bombed them with javelins from the edges, killing from a distance, methodically, making each death slow and inevitable. No formation to hold, no ground to use, no escape. Demosthenes, the man who had seen clearly from the beginning, who had been right about every assessment since his arrival, whose argument for withdrawal history has completely vindicated, surrendered with 6,000 survivors. Nicias pushed on. He reached the Asinaris River. The men saw the water and broke. 2 years of accumulated thirst and despair hit simultaneously, and the column dissolved. Men pushing forward, shoving past each other, weapons dropped, rank abandoned. They scrambled into the river to drink. The Syracusans fell on them in the water. Thucydides writes that the slaughter was beyond anything he could describe clinically. Men killed in the current. Men who climbed out cut down on the banks. The water ran dark with blood, and the army drank it anyway, because they had nothing left. No discipline, no formation. Not even the capacity to die with any order. Nicias found Gylippus on the far bank and tried to surrender personally. Not the army, just himself, in exchange for mercy for his men. Gylippus accepted. His soldiers did not stop. Both generals, Nicias and Demosthenes, were executed afterward. Gylippus reportedly wanted to bring them to Sparta as living trophies. The Syracusans and the Corinthians, who feared what Nicias knew, pressed for their deaths instead. The survivors, perhaps 7,000 men, were distributed. Many sold into slavery immediately. The rest were placed in the stone quarries outside Syracuse, the Lotomii. Working in Sicilian heat, minimal food, almost no shelter. Thucydides records that some were eventually freed when they could recite verses of Euripides, whose tragedies the Syracusans had come to love. Most did not recite anything. Most died in the quarry, far from home, under a sun that had nothing to do with justice. 200 triremes gone. 40,000 men dead, enslaved, or broken. The greatest expedition in Athenian history had produced the greatest catastrophe in Athenian history. Somewhere in Sparta, Alcibiades, the man who designed the expedition, who defected before its failure, who whispered its strategies into Spartan ears, was watching the consequences of his vision be paid by every man he had left behind. When the news reached Athens, no one believed it. Thucydides records this carefully. A barber in Piraeus heard it from a newly arrived sailor and ran to tell the city. The city arrested him for spreading panic. Then more ships came. Then more sailors. Then the assembly gathered in a silence that Thucydides calls uncharacteristic, and the numbers were confirmed, and Athens looked at itself in the mirror of what it had done. What it saw was not just military defeat. It saw the opening of a collapse that would not stop. The tribute empire began to crack within months. Subject allies who had paid their silver and kept quiet while Athens looked powerful now looked at the news from Sicily and calculated. Chios revolted. Miletus revolted. Across the Ionian coast, cities that had spent a decade waiting for this moment began peeling away from the Athenian sphere one by one. Each defection weakened the tribute base. A weaker tribute base meant less funding for the navy. A weaker navy meant less capacity to suppress the next defection. The cascade had begun, and it would not stop until it consumed the empire entirely. Sparta woke up. Alcibiades had told them what to do, and now, with Athens visibly reeling, they finally did it. They built a permanent garrison at Decelea, north of Athens, inside Attica itself. Not the seasonal raids of the early war, a year-round occupation that cut Athens off from its silver mines at Laurion and disrupted its agricultural land permanently. 20,000 slaves fled Athens to Decelia in the years that followed, including the craftsmen whose labor had funded the navy. The economic foundation of Athenian military power was now being dismantled from the inside. Then Persia entered. The Persian Empire had watched the Greek Civil War with the patience of a power that can afford to wait. Now it began funneling gold to Sparta, enough to fund a fleet, a Spartan fleet, a fleet that could, for the first time, meet Athens at sea with something approaching parity. The price was the Greek cities of Ionia, which Persia had always considered its possessions. Sparta accepted. The alliance that Themistocles and the men of Salamis had died to prevent. Sparta, armed with Persian gold, fighting Athens on the water, was now real. Athens survived longer than it deserved. In the years after Syracuse, there were moments of extraordinary resilience, naval victories at Cyzicus, at Arginusae, that proved the Athenian sailor, properly funded and led, was still the finest in the world. There was even a moment in 407 BC when Alcibiades himself, the man who designed the expedition, who defected to Sparta, who then worked his way to Persia and somehow, impossibly, maneuvered himself back into Athenian favor, returned in triumph to the harbor at Piraeus. The crowd that gathered was not an angry mob demanding his execution. It was an exhausted, astonished city that simply wanted someone to make the war make sense again. He could not. By 405 BC, the Spartan fleet, built on Persian gold, shaped by Alcibiades' intelligence, destroyed the last significant Athenian naval force at Aegospotami. The following year, Athens was blockaded and starved into surrender. The long walls came down to the music of flutes. The Spartans played while they worked because they believed they were liberating Greece. The Athenians who listened from inside their city had a different word for it. The empire was abolished. The navy was reduced to 12 ships. A Spartan-backed oligarchy, the 30 Tyrants, installed itself in power and spent its reign executing everyone who had survived long enough to be blamed. Everything Athens had built in the century since Salamis, the empire, the fleet, the political dominance, the identity as the center of the Greek world, was gone within a decade of the Asinaris River. Thucydides spent the rest of his life writing about the Peloponnesian War. He never finished it. But the Sicilian Expedition sits at the center of his analysis, because for Thucydides, Sicily was never primarily a military failure. It was something more specific and more disturbing, a case study in how power destroys itself from the inside. The easy answer is Nicias. He was cautious where boldness was needed, superstitious where rationality was essential, paralyzed by political consequences in a democracy that punished retreat. All of that is true. None of it is the real lesson. The real question is not why Nicias failed. The real question is why Athens put Nicias in command of a war he had publicly opposed and then built a political structure around him that made honest failure impossible. No mechanism for reassessment. No way to withdraw without facing a capital trial. No institutional capacity to distinguish between a bad situation that could be recovered and a catastrophic one that had to be abandoned. Athens demanded victory and made retreat fatal, and then expressed shock when its generals chose to stay in Sicily and die rather than come home and be killed by the assembly. The Sicilian Expedition was not a failure of one general. It was a failure of a system. Athens's democracy was genuinely radical, a form of collective decision-making that had, over 2 generations, produced extraordinary results. But that same democracy had structural vulnerabilities that Sicily exposed with clarity so brutal, it reads like a lesson deliberately staged. It could be moved by brilliant rhetoric. It could not easily reverse itself. It rewarded the men who brought home victories and destroyed those who returned with honest assessments of failure. It created political incentives that systematically broke military judgment at the exact moments military judgment mattered most. Nicias understood this. When he wrote home asking for permission to withdraw, he was not requesting a strategic recalculation. He was asking Athens to do something its political culture was constitutionally incapable of doing, to admit publicly, in full view, that the mission had failed and the men had to come home. Athens could not do it, and so Nicias could not do it. This is the insight that transforms the lunar eclipse from a moment of superstition into something far darker. Nicias did not stay at Syracuse because he believed the moon was an omen. He stayed because he had been staying for months, and every reason he had given for staying, every excuse, every piece of dubious intelligence about Syracusan moles and internal surrender factions, was a version of the same lie he was telling himself. The eclipse just gave the lie a cosmic costume. It gave the decision to someone other than him. It transformed his paralysis into obedience, and that was precisely what he needed it to do. The paralysis was not religious. It was human. It was the paralysis of a man trapped between an impossible command and an impossible home, looking for any authority outside himself that could authorize what he already knew had to happen. And the cost of that paralysis was paid by 40,000 men, by the soldiers drinking blood-dark water from the Asinaris, by the survivors hammering stone in the quarries of Syracuse under a sun that had nothing to do with justice, by a democracy that tore itself apart in the trauma of the aftermath, by a city that dismantled its own walls because it had nothing left inside them worth defending. Empires do not always fall to the enemy at the gates. Sometimes they fall to the decision unmade, the withdrawal untaken, the 27 days lost to a shadow crossing the face of the moon, and the man who used it as permission to keep doing what he had already been doing for 2 years. Athens had already won the war. One general chose the sky over the sword, and the war found someone else.